Just because you're not directly in the firing line, just because you're not a direct target of the CJNG, doesn't mean that they don't affect you. They are one of the main national security threats to the American population, and they have to be taken seriously.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air.
I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original, proudly presented by Montana Knife Company. This episode is about the rise of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and what makes them so different from other cartels and how they have come into possession of military-grade weapons. My guest today to discuss this is Chris Dalby. Chris is a journalist and an expert on organized crime and Mexican drug cartels. He's the author of World of Crime's Guide to Organized Crime, which released this February, and he's also the director of the World of Crime think tank. The U.S. Department of Justice has called the CJNG, which is the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the most well-armed cartel in Mexico, while a report from the Drug Enforcement Administration, also known as the DEA, stated it has a presence in 28 American cities, including Orlando, Florida, Honolulu in Hawaii, and San Juan in Puerto Rico. Let's dive in. What got you interested in the cartels in the first place? We'll get to the book a little bit later on. You know, you're in Portugal. Your accent sounds like you might be from the Alabama, Kentucky area, so not exactly not exactly proximal to the southern border. Where'd the interest come from?
So I majored in American studies. I majored in American politics, and my first steps in political journalism was following the Obama campaign, the first time he ran. From there, I became a foreign correspondent. I was in China, I was in Malaysia, I was in Brazil. And one of the things that I started noticing, two things. One is I really enjoyed the crime stories. Of course, not from the plan of what they were about, but they were what interested me more and more and more as I went on. And two, I became frustrated with the level of understanding of criminality among most foreign correspondents. I felt that they only engaged with the topics that were so core to people's lives and national security around the world when the big stories happen, you know, the El Chapo's escaping from prisons, that sort of thing. And you compare that to climate change, which, you know, equal risk to society, perhaps, or climate change a little bit more. Climate change journalists have PhDs in ecology and environmental law. For the most part, journalists covering crime are still generalists. Then I was fortunate enough to move to Mexico in 2013, and shortly after, I began working with Insight Crime, which I believe several people from which have been on your podcast. Mm-hmm. Insight Crime is the premium investigative think tank for criminal investigations in Latin America and the Caribbean. I came in as their managing editor, and that was an absolute crash course in everything about organized crime in Latin America, from cartels and cocaine all the way to fisheries, to lobster trafficking even, to the deforestation of the Amazon, and also to the way that transnational criminal networks operate across the world, and how the actions of one cartel in Mexico obviously can affect the US, but can affect drug dynamics in Hong Kong or London or Canberra in Australia. So from there, when I left Insight Crime last year, I founded World of Crime. World of Crime is a consultancy that really looks to provide actionable intelligence to law enforcement and policymakers about the way transnational crime networks operate. Essentially, we look for the gaps in intelligence and we try to address those. The first way we decided to do that was by looking at the cartels. Everybody knows about the Mexican cartels at a surface level. Even, worryingly, a lot of policymakers, a lot of law enforcement, regardless of political sides, have a very surface understanding of the cartels, fueled by a lot of what goes on in the media, fueled by a lot of the surface level interactions that they might get in security briefings. I've met people of principle, people of passion and devotion at the US border who know everything that's going on. But I've also met people who said, where do we start? And that is where sort of the last 10 years I've spent studying the cartels went into the book. and now the training courses that we're putting together.
Today's episode of Change Agents is brought to you by Onyx Off-Road. Now, some of you may have heard the term Onyx before in regards to hunting. Same company, different app, different utilization. This is specifically Onyx Off-Road. And if you like getting off the beaten path, if you like exploring where others may not like to go, then you are going to love Onyx Off-Road. It's the ultimate GPS navigation app for adventurers. When I turn this thing on, where I live up here in Kalispell, it lights up with available trail options that, quite frankly, I never would be able to, probably because I don't have the time to find and explore on my own. So with Onyx Off-Road, you can find open trails that are near you, even without cell service. And unlike Google, Onyx has real humans mapping the trails, providing detailed information on trail difficulty, descriptions, pictures, and more. So whether you're looking for rock crawling areas or checking if your trailer could make it to a dispersed camping location, Onyx Off-Road has you covered. Plus, you can explore both public lands and private properties confidentially, meaning you can look at them through the app. You can start your adventure with a 7-day free trial and experience the difference yourself. Download Onyx Off-Road today and elevate your off-roading experience. I would agree with you that most people in the United States, I think you would be hard-pressed to find somebody who doesn't have a cursory understanding of what a cartel is. They likely know that there are cartels south of the border in Mexico. They may not understand the reach and influence that they have in the United States. As an example, I live in northwestern Montana, so 60 miles from the Canadian border. The law enforcement officer friends that I have, obviously part of that is dealing with the narcotics influx, and the narcotics are still coming from Mexico, even though we are proximal to the Canadian border. They come up the west coast of California all the way up, and then the source cities from the west start dumping them in from the east. So perhaps I have a little bit more of an understanding of it, but I don't think most people understand the complexity and thoroughness of what is going on with the cartels south of the border. So I think one of the best ways to open this, if you're game, is to go from wide to narrow. I know we're going to talk about the new generation cartel and their role, but can you paint with a broad brush of the origin of these cartels? How did we get to where we are now? And then let's dive into the new generation cartel.
Of course. So to go to your point about the cursory level that people have about cartels, I actually think that cursory level hurts the way in which we fight against cartels because we don't understand the history.
Agreed.
We see them as these shadowy figures on the border that are peddling drugs to American kids. And while that is somewhat true, these are human beings who and forming criminal societies that are based on economic opportunity and political convenience. If you go back 80 years, when the first marijuana plantations, the first opium starts being made in Mexico, by the way, in the states of Sinaloa and surrounding states that are the hardcore nexus of the drug trade today, that geography hasn't changed. You first start seeing economic opportunity. Farming communities living in real poverty who see a demand for marijuana north of the border as a boon. It's essentially magnified today the same economic opportunity and the same commodity demand that is driving cartel activity today, if you look at it purely from a historical perspective. Enter 50, 60, 70 years of Game of Thrones level political machinations and coups and revolutions and brother betraying brother. But essentially, the through line for cartel is economic opportunity. The US demanding a product or products that Mexicans can provide. That's the basis of it. Then what allows the cartels to operate inside American borders? Contrary to a lot of the immigration myths of today, it's not illegal immigration. The first waves of young Mexican men who enter the US do so perfectly legally, do so through years of labor programs who allow them to enter the US to work, whether it be in industry, in construction, in agriculture, perfectly legally. And these men are not riffraff, they're not drug traffickers, they're men looking to build a better life for their families, whether it be in Mexico or in the US. When those programs are ended and when the crackdown on immigration begins, what you have is a system where a lot of those economic lifelines going back to Mexico are cut. Now, you can go on for years about whether those immigration decisions were right or wrong. What it left with were communities in Mexico dependent on money from the US, left without a lifeline. That coincides with the meth boom of the 80s, when in the California Valley, you see these super meth labs beginning to pop up. At that time, the forebears of what will become the Sinaloa cartel of El Chapo, the Jalisco cartel New Generation, the Gulf cartel, a lot of them are in California. A lot of them are in California selling Mexican marijuana and Mexican heroin and learning to make meth. And they bring that knowledge back home, and that's when Mexico begins to become this synthetic drugs powerhouse, right? So agricultural drugs, marijuana, opium, poppy, cocaine as a transporter makes the cartels rich. Synthetic drugs is what keeps them alive now through the end of the 20th and into the 21st century. The Jalisco cartel is an odd mix of both. They start as a family of wealthy avocado farmers in the state of Michoacan, the family called the Valencia. There are thousands of Valencias in Michoacan. Comically, it actually makes it very difficult for Mexican authorities to prosecute and arrest anybody, because if you're looking for Juan Valencia, there are literally dozens of them. They see the opportunity early in the 60s and 70s about marijuana and opium poppy. But they're not interested in being a cartel. They're just selling their drugs to the forebears of the Sinaloa cartel further north. Over time, more ambitious Valencias begin taking more opportunities, and expand. In the early 2000s, they get into a war with a cartel that you know very well, the Zetas. The Zetas, working for the Gulf cartel, these are former Mexican special forces who sort of turn coat and become enforcers for the Gulf cartel. The Valencias don't have anywhere near the firepower to stand up to them. There's a war in Michoacan, hundreds die, and the Valencia family loses and is exiled from Michoacan. They run from the land that made them rich over 50 years. Who do they take refuge with? The Sinaloa cartel run by El Chapo. He is looking for good information about the synthetic drug trade, which the Valencias are very good at. He's looking for access to the ports in southwestern Mexico, which the Valencias have control of. And he's looking for good money men, which the Valencias are experts at. Pass another decade, internal rebellion within the Sinaloa cartel. El Mencho, who we're going to talk about, is one of the top lieutenants within the Millennial cartel, sees a chance to break off on his own, does so in a bloody coup, and starts the Jalisco cartel New Generation in late 2010, early 2011.
I'm assuming every time there is a splinter, or every time there is somebody trying to break off and ascend to power, violence is the mechanism that is used.
Not only is that true, but the Jalisco cartel New Generation actually breaks with that tradition. The Jalisco cartel New Generation's death has been predicted by journalists going back at well over a decade. If they were seen as a group of young upstarts who would be quickly swallowed up by the Sinaloa cartel, that didn't happen. They have managed to stay united with limited splintering, some but limited. And one of the ways that they have done that is to use violence as a constant modus operandi. A lot of cartels like Sinaloa, they want to do business. They want a status quo. They won't hesitate to kill if they need to, but they want to have peace to a certain extent to move their drugs and do business. The Jalisco cartel New Generation seems oddly uninterested in that. Even at home in its home states of Jalisco and Colima, even during election campaigns in states where they're not contested, they're dropping a lot of bodies constantly. There's a statistic I refer to all the time. From 2013 to 2023, 80% of cartel violent deaths either committed by or done to the Jalisco cartel New Generation. 80% in a country with as many criminal groups as Mexico has. That is an astonishing statistic, and it shows that the CJNG in particular has taken over the monopoly on the lethal use of violence from the state.
Ladies and gentlemen, this episode of Change Agents is brought to you by Montana Knife Company. If you are a fan of the show, if you've tuned in before, you've probably heard me talking about them. They are an American-made brand. Actually, just down the road from where I'm at right now, about 120 miles away down in Frenchtown, is a man named Josh Smith, the founder of Montana Knives. And if you're a hunter, you've definitely heard about him. My favorite, my go-to actually in my pack somewhere in this room is the Mini Speed Goat. You're probably aware that they have a culinary line. They have a line that you could use for skinning, for fillet, and every use in the backcountry. But what you don't know is that on July 11th, they're going to have a tactical line. The first line, or the first knife in that line, is going to be called the War Goat. I wish I had one to show you, but that's how far into production they are right now. I don't even have one to hold up for you to see. When I do, you're definitely going to see it. And if it's anything like the other knives that Josh and Montana Knife Company make, you can be guaranteed it's going to serve every purpose that they claim it will. Go to montanaknifecompany.com to check out what they have to offer. Good luck getting one of these things when they come available, because, man, they go fast. So be prepared and be on the lookout.
You've seen what we've been able to do with the Navy SEAL Foundation in the past. We've done campaigns, films, and tons of other awesome content. Our latest Ironclad original, On the X, is made in partnership with the foundation. We are really excited about this weekly podcast and YouTube show. One of the debut episodes we're really excited to have on best-selling author and podcaster Malcolm Gladwell. Another example of a guest, Matt Frazier, who's won 5 CrossFit championships, or big wave surfer and kind of wellness advocate Laird Hamilton. Both those guys have really pushed the limits of their sports, and it's a perfect sort of example of what we want to try to do with this show.
How did they become such a powerful force? I mean, extended violent conflicts are not easy to sustain. You're going to take casualties, you're going to take losses, and to engage in them, you're going to need training, you're going to need equipment. How did they have this ability to exceed the other cartels in their ability to express violence?
So it's actually a fairly misunderstood point. There are very strong positives that the CJNG has received from its use of violence. It is involved in extremely lucrative, wide-ranging criminal opportunities. Not only sending fentanyl, meth, marijuana, and other drugs to the US, which obviously is a main economic lifeline, but also, unlike any other cartel, it puts its foot on the necks of anyone it can, everywhere it can, in any industry that it can. The level of extortion, systematic, educated, informed extortion that the CJNG propagates across Mexico, tequila industry, cattle industry, entertainment, hotels and restaurants, is unparalleled. So there's a lot of money coming into the cartel, specifically because, indeed, they have a lot of people to pay for, a lot of arms to buy, and a lot of wars to fight. That has made them tremendously wealthy. The issue is that they don't really have a home base, even though they're called Jalisco, and Jalisco is a state in Western Mexico, and their leadership is based there. That's a fairly recent thing for them. The ancestral ground of the Jalisco cartel was Michoacan. It's not like El Chapo, who had his part of southern Sinaloa, where that was his land, his people who trusted him and who loved him. They don't command that level of respect. And the level of casualties that they've taken means that now when you see the people who are being arrested or killed in CJNG wars, they're often foreigners. The commanders, the plaza bosses might be Mexican, but a lot of the rank and file are Central Americans, Salvadoran, Guatemalan. You have Colombians in there, you have Venezuelans. A lot of, and often they're hired on the internet. Often they're migrants that have been coerced and forced into fighting for the cartel. So indeed, the CJNG's extremely costly warfare has completely changed the internal dynamics and the representation of its troops.
Tell me about El Mencho, and also where do they get these names? El Chapo, El Mencho. I mean, I'm not the best at naming conventions. Creativity, I struggle with sometimes, but they seem oddly similar. I'm waiting for something a little bit more off the beaten path.
Of course. There are fairly interesting and fairly original names, but it's true. El Chapo and El Mencho. El Chapo is because he's short. Chapo means shorty in Mexican slang. And El Mencho means someone of bad taste, essentially a country bumpkin.
Oh, like a redneck.
Yeah, completely. It's a redneck. and he completely lives that reputation. El Mencho comes up. Remember I mentioned that the Valencias were wealthy avocado farmers.
Yes.
He's born in a small village in the mountains of Michoacan, near the town of Aguililla. And at the age of 11, he drops out of school to go work on an avocado farm for the Valencias, because his family's poor. He's got 6 brothers and sisters, and he needs to bring money home. From there, the story gets a little bit apocryphal because he's so legendary. There's rumors that, within a year he was running a marijuana plantation at the age of 12, or that he was moving drugs at the age of 14. It's very difficult to actually put any fact checking into those stories. They're possible. Certainly, he allies himself with the Valencias very quickly. He becomes very good friends with Abigail Valencia, who will become his second-hand man, his right-hand man as he grows older. He marries into the Valencias fairly early as a young man. He goes to California in the 80s with his wife, who's a Valencia. They have 2 children there. He's there peddling their marijuana, peddling their heroin, learning how to make meth. So he's part of the inner workings of the Valencia clan at a very early age. So he's bathed in the drug trade. He remains a middle operative until that exile I talked about with the Sinaloa cartel. When he goes to the Sinaloa cartel, he becomes a mentee for Ignacio Coronel. Ignacio Coronel was the head in Guadalajara for the Sinaloa cartel, and he was the uncle of El Chapo's wife, so a very high-ranking member of the Sinaloa cartel. El Mencho works as a bodyguard, as a hitman for him. We believe El Mencho was involved in the Matazetas, which were this hit squad that were online, these masked Avengers that were killing, 30, 40 people at a time connected to the Zetas in eastern Mexico. We believe that he was part of that, although that's never been actually confirmed. What is clear is that his power was growing, and in 2010, Ignacio Coronel is killed. The control of the Sinaloa cartel over the Valencias is broken, and he breaks off and forms the CJNG. Very quickly, it's evident that he is bloodthirsty, even at a level that for Mexican cartels is quite rare. Several people who were arrested at the time give interviews saying El Mencho is a different kind of man. El Mencho is going to bring war in a way that we haven't really seen, especially against Sinaloa. He doesn't begin by consolidating an area. He begins by aggressively going coast to coast. He understands he needs a presence on the Pacific and a presence on the Atlantic as fast as possible. The presence on the Pacific, they have it in Jalisco, Colima, and northern Michoacan. He goes into Guanajuato, takes over a lot of the oil industry there. A lot of oil pipelines are tapped up, and it's a very lucrative way for the cartel to make money. And then as quickly as he can, he moves into Veracruz, which is a big state on the east of Mexico, on the Atlantic seaboard. So within a couple of years, he's got an empire that stretches from coast to coast. Meanwhile, El Mencho concentrates on the criminal side. He doesn't concentrate on the money. For the money, he has his right-hand man, Abigail Guzman, Valencia, and his brothers, who form a clan called the Queenies. The Queenies are money laundering experts, and they take the billions in cash that El Mencho and his side have provided, and they launder it all around the world. We have rumors of the Queenies buying luxury real estate in Barcelona, buying hotels and restaurants in Mexico, investing in property in Bolivia, in Brazil, in Uruguay. So very quickly, even allegations that they had properties in Hong Kong, although that is an area that I was never able to fully crack. But so very quickly, all around the world, they're setting up these deals. So these are very ambitious young narcos, right? They're not content on doing things the old way. They want to make as much money as possible in as many ways as possible, as quickly as possible, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way.
How old is El Mencho now?
El Mencho now is 58, 59.
Okay.
The thing is, he hasn't been seen in public since 2016.
Really?
His voice has been heard on a phone call. The cult of personality around him survives because in every banner that the CJNG puts up, in every video that they put out on social media, his face or his name will be on the banner, or the troops will swear loyalty to him very publicly in almost a cultish kind of way. That's remarkable for someone who many believe him to be dead. There are narco corridos saying that he's dead. There are members of the CJNG who've turned on the group saying that he's died and they no longer have loyalty to them. I believe him to be alive for a couple of reasons. One, his death would be one of the most significant criminal changes in Mexico in a decade, and it would be almost impossible to keep that quiet. Secondly, in a few videos, there's a voice that you can hear off camera of a man who would be in his late 50s, 60s, and it's consistent. I believe that to be him. And third, the loyalty of his troops, even with this this watering down of the Mexican element, even with this foreign influx who would have no way of checking whether Mencho is alive, there are a lot of powerful lieutenants who would be all too happy to move up. So I do believe that he's in southern Jalisco, northern Colima, hiding or staying out of the limelight because he knows that getting him would be a priority for the Mexican government and the US government. He's also known to have severe kidney disease. So that also may be crippling him at the moment.
Somebody at his level, does he have to stay in Mexico? You know, you were talking about money laundering and the tentacles that spread globally, real estate. If he were to leave Mexico and say go to live his twilight years, or however you would want to describe it, in one of these places where he's laundered money, he's got a foundation, it's established, he has a palatial house that he could look out over the sea and watch the sunset. By him leaving that country, would that initiate somebody else rising up to take his position? Does he physically have to be there to have this hold?
I think so. I think we also need to consider who he is as a man. His nickname is El Mencho, right? He's a country bumpkin. He's taken that on board as his identity. He did live sometime in California. He was in prison in the US for a couple of years. Apart from that, we don't know him to have traveled. There are plenty of rumors out there that he fled to Australia at one point. Australian police, I believe, investigated that and said they couldn't find any semblance of that. I believe Mencho is sick. He's an aging guy. I don't believe, speaks much English. And yes, there's not much history of Mexican narcos keeping their power outside the country. In fact, almost none. They are it's not the Colombians who you saw after Escobar leave the country and start these drug trafficking empires while they were living abroad. Mexicans are much more tied to their land. Even in the case of Mencho and the lack of a power base that I mentioned, I think he's quite comfortable living in areas where he knows he's safe.
This episode of Change Agents is brought to you by Mountain Tough. I've done a few things in my life, not all of them physical, but there is one thing that I believe. When I have been successful, it has largely been because of the physical capacity and capability I had at the time. The brain is what solves the problems, but it's only as good as the chassis that it is built upon. And that is what I think the value of strength and conditioning, or conditioning in general, is for everybody, regardless of what it is that you do. If you want the muscles, or the muscle, I should say, between your ears to work at peak performance, you need to focus on everything from the neck down as well. The cool thing about Mountain Tough, or some of the cool things I should say about Mountain Tough, is you can do it anywhere, right? You can, if you have an internet connection, if you have a device that connects to the internet, you can find the workouts that are suited for you. And it doesn't matter what level of conditioning you're starting, they have a program that works for you. Then there's also a community of people that can help hold you accountable, that you can interface with, ask questions, and join in. I mean, we all know that doing something arduous is better when you're sharing that suffering. Camaraderie, right? It's a combination of pain and laughter. That's my description of it. And some of these workouts hurt. That's okay. The benefit from that is worth it. If you have a community to share it with, it's going to keep you on board that much longer. So Mountain Tough is offering Change Agents listeners an incredible offer. 40% off on the all-new Mountain Tough Plus annual subscription with the code ChangeAgents. The way that I'm looking at that, it's one word in all uppercase. Go to MTN, that is Mike, Tango, November, Tough, regular spelling.com, and enter the code ChangeAgents to receive 40% off, a savings of about $100 on your Mountain Tough Plus annual subscription. That's MTNtough.com, and enter the code ChangeAgents to save 40%. That's less than 50 cents per day for the best-in-class physical and mental training available to you. It was, I believe it was on X, but it showed what looked like a militarized convoy of up-armored vehicles, individuals standing on both sides. I mean, the uniforms varied, but let's say they certainly had a uniformed presence. They were wearing body armor. It appeared that they were wearing flags of allegiance of some kind. It appeared that they were wearing identification marks, whether that be individual identification or rank identification inside of that structure. The weaponry that they were holding was modern era for sure, military grade weapons. Where are they getting all of this? I mean, honestly, it was impressive to see the hardware that they had lined up on full display.
They wanted you to see that, and that's exactly the reaction that they wanted. The CJNG are masters of PR, always have been, and their PR manifests through violence and armed force. They were the first cartel in 2015 to hit and shoot down a Air Force helicopter, while that helicopter was actually involved in a chase of El Mencho. They were the first to use drone warfare in Mexico. They have an amazing range of weaponry, whether it be 50 cal, obviously AK-47s, AR-15s, Barretts, anti-tank weaponry. That show of force was carefully designed. Their best assets are at the front with legitimately fearsome armored vehicles and heavy-grade weaponry. But if you go down the line, and you look carefully, and there are some analysis of this online, you see that the vehicles do look less impressive as you go back, right? It's not a uniform show of force as you go back, right? It's like the North Korean military parade, right? You put your most impressive tanks at the front, missiles at the front. That's not to say they're not well armed. They're armed to the teeth, and they have significant firepower. Most of it does come from the US. About 70% of guns that the cartels have at all scales comes from the US. Most of it is what you can buy legally in weapons shops, right? Often through straw purchases.
Yeah.
US citizens who buy those guns legally and then get them to the border. Of course, there have been some colossal cock-ups from the US government, Fast and Furious, wide receiver, where guns were allowed to go into Mexico and then traced. That was a colossal failure, and those guns were later known to have killed many, many people. But there is also a lot of misinformation out there, and this is one of the things I was talking about at the beginning, about misinformation fueling response to the cartels. There was a video, I think last year, showing what Mexican media purported to be a javelin, right? The anti-tank weapon, the javelin, US made.
Trust me, near and dear to my heart. I was going to ask you about this. The reports that javelins that were supposed to be headed to Ukraine somehow made it south of the border. Trust me, we were going to talk deeply about this. I love this missile.
That's not true.
Damn it. Actually, it's a good thing.
To my knowledge, of course, tomorrow there'll be a video on Twitter showing the CJNG using a javelin. To my knowledge, that video did not show a javelin. It showed a Swedish anti-tank weapon called an AT-4. There are many AT-4s used in the US Army. There are many AT-4s in Ukraine. It is theoretically possible that they got that from Ukraine, but it's unlikely since the Mexican Army uses AT-4s and significant armies in the Americas do as well. While the US is the major source for guns going to cartels, there are other ways for them to get military-grade weaponry. There are plenty of guns in Central America left over from the civil wars of those countries from the 80s and 90s. The Venezuelan, the Ecuadorian, the Colombian arsenals have been raided, and many weapons sold to criminal groups in those countries. And we see US weapons that were traced to the Mexican cartels suddenly popping up in Ecuador and Colombia. So we know that criminal groups are trading these weapons as well, right? They show up in the Caribbean as well. So there is a huge interconnected web of arms trafficking between criminal groups outside the US. Of course, there are stockpiles of weapons from the Middle East, from coups in North and West Africa that we know have made their way also across the Atlantic. So trust me, the Mexican cartels are regular shoppers of whatever weaponry they can avail themselves of. But that specific video about the javelin, to my knowledge, was not true.
So having weaponry is one thing. The tactical prowess to use it is another. How do they rank, let's say, maybe against the Mexican military in their tactical abilities?
They have received training, and this is Mexican cartels generally. We know that there have been camps of, the Zetas, for example, right, Mexican special forces who go rogue. We know that there have been Colombian troops, Guatemalan commandos have trained Mexican cartels going back decades. However, I think their tactical prowess is quite overblown. They don't compare to the Mexican military. And this is one thing the Mexican military is fairly consistent about in when you ask them about how they're used against the cartels. They say, if you want us to go in, dominate an area, capture a target with appropriate planning and intelligence, we can do that. It'll be a bloodbath, but we can do that, right? And it's fairly well accepted that if, knowing where a cartel leader was, if the Mexican army was willing to go in and take casualties, they would be able to neutralize that target. A lot is made of what is called the Culiacanazo, where Mexican troops arrested Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo, in the city of Culiacan, and suddenly hundreds or thousands of cartel gunmen flooded the streets, set up blockades, surrounded where he was, and forced his release. That's true. That did happen. But this wasn't a planned battle. This was an unexpected arrest in the heartland of the Sinaloa cartel, in the city where they are strongest, where they have the most men, where there was no time for the army to respond in a way that they would secure that asset, and the Mexican president ordered his release. So it's not really a fair game to say, well, that proves that the cartels are stronger than the Mexican army. That was a very specific set of circumstances. What usually happens is the CJNG or another cartel will have some limited military strategy. They'll use drone explosives to scare communities. They'll issue warnings for people to clear out of the way. But the actual fighting is usually skirmish level, right? Mm-hmm. It's usually skirmish level. It's usually small arms, let's say up to 50 cal. Drone warfare hasn't killed a lot of people. These tanks that they haven't killed a lot of people. Most of their actual fighting is at the skirmish level.
What is the Mexican government's approach to either defeating or dealing with the CJNG?
The outgoing Mexican government of López Obrador seemed to believe, and sadly to believe correctly, that his very high popularity wouldn't be affected by just sweeping the cartels under the rug. There's this legend that he favors a hugs not bullets approach. I don't believe that. I think that was just a line he said in a policy speech. I don't think that was ever a formal policy. Although yes, he got very defensive when the US accused Mexico of not doing enough to stop fentanyl, or of not doing enough to arrest top cartel members. He didn't do much. He really didn't do much. There were no notable arrests, apart from maybe Ovidio Guzman, and I think that was not him, but the Mexico City authorities that were in on that. There was really no cooperation with the US, with the DEA, on enforcing any measures, on new approaches, on old approaches. It was essentially a policy desert for the last 6 years. And the CJNG used that to dramatically ramp up the number of wars it's fighting. In my book, I have a chapter just called The Many, Many Wars of the CJNG, and it just goes, I think it was 28 or 30 groups that it's fighting across the country. The problem with that is that without political involvement in the fight against organized crime, Mexican cartels have been allowed to basically do what they want. And that hasn't resulted in one cartel being dominant, or the Sinaloa cartel, the CJNG, taking over more space. It's led to a lot of little feuds becoming much bigger. It's led to a lot of little groups having the space to grow uncontested by law enforcement. And so the cartel map of Mexico is much more complex and diverse now than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
From a policy perspective, knowing what you know about the cartels, if you were the United States, if you were able to get the ear of one of our presidential candidates, or let's just say whoever wins, right? We'll fast forward through whatever the next 6 months is going to look like. And you're able to get the ear of somebody who can actually throw levers and change policy. As a country in the United States, what would you do to actually have an impact on their influence north of the border, right? Mexico, I mean, I don't think you can say that you could ignore Mexico and let them handle it themselves, but what would you do on the things that we have direct control over, our own policy in the United States? How would you reduce their seemingly endless funnel of money and power and influence in the United States?
3 words: follow the money. One thing that has been shocking, both in the US and in Mexico, is the lack of long-term cooperation on financial investigation. It's shocking. You can endlessly debate the drug debate, whether it should be decriminalization or legalization or harsher sentencing. The demand for drugs in the US seems inexorable. The ability of the cartels to acquire guns in the US based on the Second Amendment is inexorable. So those are two things where you can have nice, shiny statistics in your end-of-year reports to justify your budgets, but you're not actually making a difference. What's going to make a difference is cutting off the financial flows available to these cartels. It's extremely difficult. Specifically, the CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel are master money launderers through the black peso market system at the US border, where perfectly legitimate companies are roped into sending money to Mexico in exchange for goods without knowing they're participating in a cartel financing. Whether it's the Chinese shadow banking system, right? Whether it's trade for trade, where fentanyl or its chemical precursors are being swapped essentially or bartered for wildlife products coming from Mexico. Whether it's drugs being traded for other drugs to specifically stay off the radar of authorities. Whether it's the multiple involvements in crypto schemes, especially now with Southeast Asian syndicates that are laundering a lot of money. There are endless ways in which the cartels can launder money. However, a lot of it stays at home. A lot of the front companies, of the shell companies that these guys own are in Mexico and actually are in Jalisco and Sinaloa. So there are steps that the US could take in partnership with Mexico, in partnership with international financial institutions, to really go after Mexican funding, Mexican money laundering in an organized way. To date, there have been some small successes on an operation-by-operation basis, but a systematic continued push hasn't happened. And part of that is because the US is so divided politically on how to deal with the cartels, right? The word cartel is enough to set up a political firestorm.
When I woke up, very confused, she said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
Change is very scary. As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
You just sensed that it was out there.
It was like they'd been hit by a nuclear bomb.
This could go so many different directions.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed in this world to push ourselves even farther.
Almost always some degree of growth that's available to us if we are very intentional about it.
I could talk to you for probably another 2 hours.
My experience with the world is that if you try and do something hard and you give it your best shot, people are unbelievably accepting of the result.
Thanks again for coming on the X.
Yeah, I could see that there would be, well, I think immigration policy is probably a 50-50 split, depending on what side of the aisle that you may put your seat on. But the cartels and the influence they have, and again, northwestern Montana, meth is one of the biggest drugs that we deal with.
Right.
It is from Mexico. The impact of meth on individuals and families and communities is literally right in front of your face. I see it every day. It's horrible. I don't know what to do about it. But whether or not, immigration policy, we put that to the side, I feel like I would wish as a country that we could come together on dealing with the organizations that have their foot on the gas pedal to the floor of pushing that stuff into this country. And I wonder your thoughts on this. If it doesn't make any sense to you why they haven't already, do you think that they are just ignoring it intentionally because it's too hot of a potato to handle?
I don't think they're ignoring it intentionally. I believe that there's a resignation and that nobody has any fresh ideas. One of the biggest misconceptions about Mexican cartels is that they're the ones, and I know you know this not to be true, but they're the ones selling the drugs directly on American streets. They're not.
No.
They rely, they're the wholesalers, right? They're the manufacturers and the wholesalers. They rely on an extremely wide-ranging network of large and small criminal partners who buy the drugs. And there's even several chains before you get to, let's say rural Montana, where, those drugs are going to go through several hands before being distributed at the street level in Montana or wherever. The problem is that those networks are almost impossible to unravel. As the U.S. economy has nosedived, as more and more people have been pushed into precarious financial conditions, those both turning to drugs as a means of alleviating that pain, and those turning to organized crime as a way of making ends meet, has caused both the supply and the demand side to benefit, right? One thing that I think is off-putting to me is the rhetoric. In a place where we have a vacuum of policy ideas, the rhetoric is ever more strident, ever more extreme, ever more violent. I'm in no way saying that the cartels should not be punished. I'm in no way saying that the cartels should not be put in the ground if they need to be. But what I'm saying is that these are humans making human decisions. And for every cartel member dismembering someone screaming on Twitter, you have hundreds of people involved in the cartels because that's the only way they can live, right? Your average meth cook in rural Jalisco is not the one moving drugs across the border. He's not the one selling drugs to the Mexican mafia in LA. He's not the one selling meth to American kids. He's just making more money that way, often forced to do so, because that's the only way he can bring home and food on the table. So I think we need to take a step back in terms of the human element and try and understand the human and the economic decisions that underpin every step of that chain. That comes with a bit of compassion. That comes a bit of compassion for drug users, understanding what they've done. That comes for me with some lenient sentencing for low-level drug traffickers. Focusing on that part of the echelon does nothing. Top traffickers can find 10 guys to peddle drugs on the street tomorrow if you take 10 out, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to build long-term, and I mean long-term, multi-year, multi-country investigations. And when you move, you arrest the guy who triggers a cascade movement, and you at least temporarily really disrupt the ability to move drugs into America. I think that's the long-term policy making, the long-term investigations that has been lacking. Again, there have been some notable exceptions and some notable successes. Particularly the involvement of Canadian law enforcement recently has been really encouraging. There have been a lot of joint operations in Mexico, US, Canada that have found some really powerful networks and taken them down. But those are really, you can count them on the fingers of one hand.
Yeah. Chris, tell me about your book.
So the book is called CJNG, A Quick Guide to Mexico's Deadliest Cartel. It's not an A to Z of the entire cartel. It's meant to be a primer of what do you need to know today in mid-2024 about what this cartel is, where it comes from, how it makes money, and the national security threats that it poses to US and Mexico. It's targeted at both law enforcement who want to know the basics of this group in a thorough way, and also to a general audience who want to just understand a little bit more about this boogeyman that has been put in front of them. A legitimate threat, but often discussed in false ways.
That sounds good. We're coming to the end of our time here. One final question for you, and this is the one I always struggle with on some of these issues. Or I shouldn't say that I struggle with on these issues. I think some people struggle with. A lot of people do. And that is, why should they care? We hear about cartels. We hear about violence. How is secondary. Why should people care? And if you can get them to care, how can they do something about it, right? Again, northwestern Montana. How do I get somebody who I'm going to see in a coffee shop to care about the cartels and tie that into their life? And then what do they do with that information?
Every person in the US, in some way or other, is threatened by an activity the cartel is involved in. Do you have a family member or a friend whose lives have been taken or ravaged by meth or fentanyl? You have an interest in making sure that doesn't happen to somebody else. Are you eating a ton of guac on Super Bowl day? Well, that guacamole probably comes from avocados made in Michoacan that the CJNG has got very rich of. Do you have a relative, or do you own a timeshare? Then it's likely that at some point someone working in a CJNG call center will call you to try and defraud you out of your timeshare investment. Do you enjoy going on holiday to Mexico on spring break, perhaps? Then the hotel, the restaurant, the bar, the taqueria that you frequent is probably being shaken down by a cartel on a weekly basis. Just because you're not directly in the firing line, just because you're not a direct target of the CJNG, doesn't mean that they don't affect you. They are one of the main national security threats to the American population, and they have to be taken seriously. Now, whether they should be designated a terrorist organization, that's a very loaded political football. What do people do with that information? People need to think in their life, what aspect of that are they affected by, and what can they do to either protect themselves or educate those around them. If your grandma owns a timeshare, have a conversation with her about, do you trust someone who calls you about that timeshare? If you see someone struggling with drugs, if you see someone struggling to put food on the table, okay, what can you do with them to try and steer them away from a life of drugs? These seem very trite and general advice, but every one of those steps that stops the cartel from making money is helping. And that's really the only thing that people can do on an individual basis. At the law enforcement level, I am shocked and a little bit worried about the piecemeal approach that is being taken in US law enforcement to the cartels. At the federal level, at the state level, yes, you have major operations, major fact-finding missions. That does not trickle down to your county sheriff offices. That does not trickle down to your average police departments along the border, where I've been there a lot and I talk to these police officers, and what they tell me they believe, they're like, oh yeah, we know about the CJNG, and then they peddle not lies because they don't believe lying, but mistruths, and that worries me. And that is in part what the book and future issues of the series are going to try and address.
Outside of your book, where would you point people resource-wise to educate themselves on cartel issues writ large in Mexico?
I think there are three resources for English speakers that I would point to. One is Inside Crime. Uncontested, the best journalism that's being done in the Americas on organized crime. Second is Crisis Group. If you're looking for Inside Crime, is going to give you the news articles, right? The daily happenings about cartel life. If you're looking for deeper policy stuff, look at Crisis Group. Crisis Group is an amazing global NGO that looks at conflict and organized crime around the world. And the third is one particular journalist called Joan Grillo. Joan Grillo has a blog called Crash Out Media. Every week he's posting about the latest cartel happenings and what that means for Mexican security, and he's unmatched.
Awesome. Chris, I'll let you have the final thoughts for the viewers and listeners before we close it out today.
I think that the misconceptions about the cartels shouldn't be taken as a reason to panic. Cartels are an ever-present threat. They continue to be financially loaded, armed to the teeth, and are increasing their ability to affect American lives. That doesn't mean that we should be worried. That means that we should get educated. And that means that everybody from the FBI director onto Joe Blogs on the street has to have an understanding of what cartels are, how they operate in America, and how they touch everybody's lives in a different way.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. You can learn more about Chris's work at worldofcrime.net. Just click the link down in the show notes. Thank you again for listening to Change Agents and supporting the show. It's an Ironclad original, proudly presented by Montana Knife Company. We're going to be back next week with an all-new episode.